Golden light spilled through dusty window panes, casting long shadows across the creaking wooden floor. The air was thick with tension as heavy boots scraped forward and a stranger's hand closed around the grip of a revolver, steel glinting under the lamp. Time seemed to slow. Clara's eyes widened, her breath caught. In the instant the trigger snapped, Caleb surged forward, his frame a wall between her and the gun. The shot tore through the air, biting into flesh, crimson blooming across the worn fabric of his shirt. In the crowded room, where truth was smothered by bullets and power, a single gunshot rang out. Caleb threw himself before Clara, blood soaking his coat. The town fell silent. And then, through her tears, Clara spoke the secret she had buried for 5 long years. Ghost Fork, Texas Panhandle, August 1875. The midnight market in Ghost Fork was never marked on any map. It drifted like smoke from a dying fire, appearing wherever the law turned its head and disappearing before the sun could expose it. That night, under a sagging canvas tent lit by lanterns that burned with more smoke than light, the air was heavy with dust, sweat, and the stench of whiskey. Men pressed close together, voices rough from tobacco and long nights, throwing bids on everything from horses to saddles, and later, people. Toward the center, on a raised wooden platform, stood a girl no older than 17. Her hair was a tangle of dark knots, her dress torn at the hem, dust clinging stubbornly to the faded fabric. Her hands, clasped tightly before her, trembled faintly, but her eyes were dry, gray as campfire ash. Empty. "She don't talk, don't remember," the auctioneer barked, patting the post behind her as if showing off a stubborn mule. $5. Take her or leave her." A few men chuckled, one spat into the dirt. They called her Ghost Girl, no name, no papers, just another body passing through the shadows of the plains. She had walked out of the prairie scrub alone the week before, and in a place like Ghost Fork, that made her fair game. From the edge of the crowd, Caleb Mercer stood still as stone. His boots were powdered with trail dust, his hat pulled low. Most men here didn't know him, and those who did rarely heard him speak. Some thought he couldn't. Others had simply stopped expecting his voice. Without a word, he stepped forward, coat brushing against shoulders, the crowd parting reluctantly. From his pocket, he pulled 5 tarnished silver dollars. Honest coin, worn smooth from years of use. He didn't raise them high, just let them fall into the auctioneer's tin bucket with a sound that rang sharper than any bid that night. The crowd fell quiet. The auctioneer grunted, shoved the girl toward the edge of the platform. She moved slowly, not looking back. Caleb reached out, taking her elbow, not to drag, not to claim ownership, but to guide her through the gap in the crowd. Laughter followed them into the night, low and mocking. But outside, under the open sky, the air was cleaner. The stars stretched wide above, and the moon traced a silver path north. Neither spoke. For the first time in what felt like forever, the girl walked beside someone who didn't tell her where to go, only showed her the way. Caleb didn't speak as they walked away from the market, the girl's bare feet kicking up dust under the pale wash of moonlight. His Mustang, an aging but steady creature named Flint, waited just beyond the tent's shadow. Caleb loosened the saddle blanket and offered it to her. She hesitated only a moment before wrapping it around her shoulders, her thin frame disappearing beneath the worn wool. He mounted first, then extended a gloved hand. She stared at it for a heartbeat, measuring, weighing, before placing her small fingers in his. The lift was gentle, almost cautious, as though he feared startling her. She sat behind him without a word, her hands lightly gripping the back of his coat instead of holding on tight. Caleb didn't push. They rode north through the scrubland, the night wind whispering through mesquite and sage. He kept the pace steady, never glancing back to see if she faltered. If she needed to stop, he figured she'd tell him, if not in words, then in her own way. By dawn, the horizon blushed with the first streaks of pink. They reached a narrow canyon where the wind curled around the rock like a living thing. Tucked at its edge stood Caleb's cabin, hand-hewn pine walls, a patched roof, a porch that groaned when stepped on. It was no palace, but it was solid, and it was his. He unlocked the door with a brass key, holding it open for her. Inside was a single room, a stone hearth against the far wall, a table and two chairs, a cot in the corner, and another bedroll rolled tight near the fire. Without speaking, he poured a cup of water from the tin pitcher and set it on the table. Then he pointed to the cot, then to himself, showing where she would sleep and where he would. The message was clear. She had her own space. No locks, no chains, no demands. The first day passed in silence. She drank the water slowly, eyes tracking his movements without fear, but without trust either. That night, he left her the cot and took his bedroll to the porch. On the second morning, when Caleb returned from checking traps, the chipped cup from breakfast was rinsed and left upside down to dry. She sat on the porch braiding a strip of fabric torn from her dress into a loop. He said nothing, just nodded. On the third day, he placed a leather-bound notebook and a stub of pencil on the table. On the first page, in blocky, careful letters, he'd written, "Write what you remember." For hours, the book sat untouched. But the next morning, 3 shaky words appeared. "I saw fire." Beneath them, in his own hand, Caleb wrote, "Sometimes nothing is a mercy." The exchange became their language. Small acts, quiet offerings, a wooden comb, a bar of soap wrapped in cloth, a mended shirt folded neatly on his bedroll. Bit by bit, the walls between them thinned. And one evening, with the fading light spilling gold across the floorboards, she took the pencil, hesitated, then wrote a name across a scrap of leather. Clara. It wasn't a memory yet, but it was hers, and that was enough for now. The morning was cool, the canyon air carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Clara had begun to move through the cabin and its surroundings with a quiet ease, feeding the chickens without being asked, sweeping the porch while Caleb mended tack in the barn. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was no longer fear. That day, while sorting through a tangle of old harness straps in the barn, her fingers brushed against something soft. She knelt, pushing aside a warped feed barrel. From beneath it, she pulled a folded square of fabric, yellowed with age and frayed at the edges. A handkerchief. She carried it into the light spilling through the barn's cracked roof. On one corner, the embroidery was nearly worn away by time, but 2 letters remained. CR. The stitching was delicate. The thread, once a deep blue, now faded to smoke. Her breath caught. She didn't know why, but the sight of those letters made her chest tighten. She turned them over and over in her hands as if the cloth might whisper the answers she couldn't remember. When Caleb returned from checking the traps, she placed the handkerchief on the table beside the leather notebook he had given her. In her careful, slanted handwriting, she wrote, "I think it's mine." Caleb studied the cloth for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. Without a word, he crossed the room to the shelf above the hearth and pulled down a weathered roll of maps, the kind cattlemen used to track grazing lands. He unrolled them across the table, smoothing the creases with his hands. "Here," he murmured. It was the first word she'd heard him speak since the night market. His voice was low, gravelly from disuse, yet steady. He tapped a spot on the map. Rutherford Ranch, north of a small town called Hollow Bluff. The sound of her name on his lips, Clara, came next. It was quiet, almost tentative, as though he were afraid to break something fragile. She hadn't realized until that moment that he'd never said it aloud before. The name hung in the air between them, heavier than the dust motes drifting in the light. A shiver went through her. Not fear, but recognition. Somewhere deep inside, it rang true, even if she couldn't see the full picture yet. That night, she lay awake long after the lamp was blown out, the handkerchief folded beneath her pillow. In her mind's eye, flashes came, sunlight falling across red shutters, the sound of a woman's voice calling a name she couldn't quite hear, the smell of fresh bread cooling on a windowsill. The images were scattered like shards of a mirror, but for the first time, she felt she might be able to fit them together. By morning, the letters CR no longer felt like strangers stitched into fabric. They felt like a door, one she was finally ready to open. The day began like any other, sunlight spilling through the cabin's small windows, the smell of cornbread warming on the hearth. Caleb had just returned from the lower ridge with a bucket of fresh water, dust clinging to his boots. Clara was kneeling by the fire, hands deep in dough, her cheeks streaked with flour. The knock at the door was soft. Too soft. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He set the bucket down quietly and moved to the door, opening it just enough to see the man standing there. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes, but the coat was travel-worn, the boots scuffed from long miles. His smile was quick. Too quick. "Morning," the stranger said. "Name's Wade Harrow. I'm looking for a trail that leads back to Hollow Bluff. You know the way?" Caleb didn't answer right away. The man shrugged, glancing past him as if trying to see inside. "Heard there might be a bounty posted out that way." The air in the cabin tightened. Caleb shifted, stepping forward until his frame blocked the door entirely. "Ain't no trail through here," he said, his voice even but hard. "Best you ride back." Harrow studied him for a moment, his eyes calculating. Then he tipped his hat and walked away. Caleb watched until the man disappeared down the trail. When he turned back, Clara was gone. He found her in the root cellar, crouched behind a stack of old crates, her breathing fast and shallow. Her eyes were wide, but not with surprise. This was recognition. "He had a badge once," she whispered. Caleb didn't ask how she knew. He simply nodded. By nightfall, they had packed what little they could carry. Flint was saddled, and Clara's mare, Midge, was ready. They rode out under a sliver of moon, keeping to dry ravines and narrow ridgelines, avoiding the main roads where strangers might ride. On the third day, they reached a trading post, a scatter of tents and wagons under the open sky. While Caleb watered the horses, a boy no older than 6 ran into Clara, tears streaking his dust-covered face. "Mama's gone," he sobbed. Without hesitation, Clara knelt, took his hand, and sketched a quick, simple map on a scrap of paper. She pointed to the well, guided him toward the tents. The boy's tears slowed. Caleb watched her then, something shifting in his gaze. She was no longer just a woman running from her past. She was someone finding her place in the world again. The town of Hollow Bluff sat pressed into the red clay hills, its main street a crooked line of storefronts leaning into the wind. Caleb kept his hat low as they rode in, Clara tucked inside his coat collar against the chill. They were strangers here, and that was the point. At the far end of the street stood a narrow building with faded lettering above the door. Hale and Associates, attorney at law. Inside, the air smelled of dust, paper, and the faint trace of bourbon. Behind a desk stacked with files sat Jonas Hale, a man whose once crisp suit had surrendered to time. He looked up as they entered, his gaze flicking from Caleb to Clara, and then stopping. Not on her clothes or face, but on the way she stood, alert, guarded, like someone who'd learned to expect betrayal. "Eliza Rutherford?" Jonas asked softly, using a name Clara hadn't heard in years. She stiffened. Caleb's shoulders tensed, but Clara didn't run. Slowly, she reached into her coat and laid 2 items on the desk: the handkerchief with CR stitched in blue, and a torn page from her leather notebook. In careful handwriting, it read, "I remember the letters." Jonas picked up the paper, his expression tightening. 5 years ago, I received a series of unsigned letters, detailed accounts of land fraud, falsified deeds, bribes. They stopped the night the mayor's house burned down, and his daughter vanished. He glanced at Clara. "That was you." Caleb's jaw worked, but he kept silent. Jonas leaned forward. "What you sent me could have ended the racket that's been bleeding this county dry. The men you exposed are still in power, and if they learn you're alive—" The sound of shattering glass cut him off. A bottle smashed against the far wall, flames licking the curtains before anyone could move. "Move!" Caleb barked, pulling Clara toward the back door. Jonas grabbed a thick folder from under his desk, the same folder that men would kill to destroy, and stumbled after them. The front room ignited fast, dry paper and aged wood feeding the fire. Smoke billowed, choking the air. Caleb kicked the back door open, shoving Clara into the alley as embers rained down like angry fireflies. They crouched behind a stack of crates, the heat pressing against their backs. Clara clutched the folder, coughing hard but refusing to let go. Jonas was bent over, gasping, his face grim. "They wanted the last copy destroyed," he rasped. "Well," Caleb said, eyes scanning the alley for movement, "they didn't get it." Clara's fingers trembled as she opened her notebook and scrawled 4 words. "Let's finish it now." Jonas met her eyes and nodded. "Then we'll need to make noise loud enough they can't bury." Caleb's hand brushed the revolver at his side. Noise, he said quietly. I can do. And in that moment, the three of them knew there was no going back. Night settled heavy over the abandoned mill they'd taken shelter in, the lantern light pooling on the scarred wooden table between them. Outside, the wind rattled loose boards, carrying with it the faint tang of smoke from the fire that had consumed Jonas Hale's office. Jonas had gone to sleep in the far corner, his coat rolled into a pillow, leaving Caleb and Clara alone with the quiet. Caleb sat hunched, a piece of sandpaper in his hand, running it along the grain of his rifle stock. His eyes were fixed on the wood, but his mind was far away. Clara waited. She had learned not to press him. When Caleb Mercer spoke, it was because the words had fought their way past the walls he kept around himself. Finally, he set the rifle aside. My name, his voice was low, gravel edged with something heavier. Ain't Caleb Mercer. It's Elias Rowe. The name hung in the air, foreign and yet worn, like a coat pulled from the back of a closet. I wasn't a killer, he continued, staring at his hands. But I was in the wrong place, wrong time. A card game turned bad. A man with a badge needed someone to blame. And I was it. His jaw clenched. 5 years in Leavenworth. You learn two things in a place like that: how to fight and how to keep your mouth shut. I came out meaner than I went in. Figured if I stayed quiet, kept moving, I could vanish. Clara's gaze softened. She reached for her leather notebook and flipped to the first page, the one where her early handwriting was jagged, scared. She laid her hand over it. We both lived lies, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But now we choose truth. He met her eyes for the first time that night. In the glow of the lantern, the weight in his expression seemed to shift, not gone, but no longer locked away. You know what going back means, he said. She nodded. If we don't, they win, and people keep losing their land, their homes, their lives. For a moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against the mill's walls. Then Caleb stood, buckling his holster. Ghost fork, then? Clara reached for the harmonica case she always kept close. Inside, alongside the handkerchief and the incriminating deed schematic, lay a single folded page from Jonas's rescued folder. She closed it, met Caleb's steady gaze, and said, We've both been ghosts long enough. He allowed himself the faintest smile. For what it's worth, he murmured, I never meant to keep running. I just forgot what it felt like to have something worth standing for. Clara stepped to his side. Then stand with me now. And under the dim lantern light, with the night wind roaring in the eaves, they gathered what little they owned, truth, names, and the courage to use both, and began the ride back toward Ghost Fork, not as fugitives but as two souls ready to face the fire. The town hall in Ghost Fork hadn't seen a gathering like this in years. Every wooden bench was filled, hats clutched in hands, the air thick with heat and the low hum of uneasy whispers. The word hearing had been scrawled in charcoal on the wall behind a makeshift podium. Clara stepped forward, her cream dress plain but spotless. The folder from Jonas Hale clutched against her chest. Caleb stood just behind her, silent as ever, a steady presence. My name is Clara Rutherford, she began, her voice trembling but clear. 5 years ago, I disappeared. They said I ran. They said I betrayed my family. But I ran because I saw what they were doing, signing away land to criminals, erasing county records, trading power for silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jonas moved beside her, holding up the singed but intact documents. These match the missing deeds from the mayor's office, he said. The fire was meant to destroy them. One from the back, a hard voice cut through. You've got no proof. 3 of Mayor Green's men shoved their way forward, faces twisted with anger. One spat, She's a runaway. He's a convict. The first man raised his revolver. Everything seemed to slow. Caleb moved instantly, stepping in front of Clara just as the gunshot cracked through the room. The bullet tore into his side, the force driving him to one knee. Clara's scream echoed off the wooden walls as she caught him, her hands pressing against the spreading crimson. "Stand down!" Jonas roared, his voice shaking the benches. But it was the townsfolk who moved first, men and women stepping forward, some blocking the mayor's men, others forcing them to drop their weapons. "He saved my son's cattle," someone called. "He pulled my brother from the flood," another added. The tide of voices grew, no longer whispers, but a united wall. Green's men, suddenly outnumbered, backed toward the door. Jonas raised the folder high. These crimes won't be buried again?" Clara looked down at Caleb, her tears falling freely. "He's not nobody," she told the crowd, her voice breaking. "He's Caleb Mercer, and he saved me." Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in gold, and inside, the power in Ghost Forks shifted, not with more bullets, but with the will of a town that had finally decided to stand. The cell in Ghost Forks' modest jailhouse was cleaner than Caleb expected, but it didn't matter. Bars were still bars. His name, Caleb Mercer, now written beside his real one, Elias Rowe, marked the intake log. He sat straight, arms folded, his face calm. He had stopped running. The door creaked open. Clara stepped in with Jonas Hale at her side, and the new mayor, Marjorie Kelt, a stout woman with steady eyes and a reputation for fairness. She carried a folded sheet of paper. "Eliza Rutherford's statement stands," Marjorie said firmly. "You were hunted for the name they gave you, not the man you chose to be. The court sees the difference. You're free." Caleb rose slowly. Clara didn't smile. She simply reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. Together they walked out into the cool evening. They didn't return to Hollow Bluff or to her family's estate. Instead, they rode toward the quiet hills above Last Canyon, where the wind sighed through the pines and the soil smelled of rain. The old cabin still leaned a little in the wind, chickens scratching near the porch as if nothing had changed. One morning, Clara hammered a wooden sign into place between the gateposts. The words burned deep into the grain read, "Home, where no one runs anymore." Caleb stood beside her, hand resting on the post. "You sure about that?" he asked. She met his gaze. "You're not running, and I'm not hiding." A year passed like a gentle wind through spring wheat. They repaired fences, planted herbs by the window, and left bread cooling on the sill for neighbors who stopped by unannounced. The townfolk, once curious, became friends. Jonas visited now and then, bringing her blank journals tied with twine. When the oak tree bloomed, they held a small ceremony beneath it. There was no preacher, no vows, just Clara in a simple dress and Caleb in his cleanest shirt, standing together while Jonas read a single line from her notebook. She stayed, he stayed, and that was enough. A little girl, barefoot and bright-eyed, ran between them, clutching a wooden toy horse. "Mama! Papa!" she squealed before tumbling into Caleb's arms. Clara caught her, laughter mingling with quiet tears. No ghosts, no chains, just a family in a home where no one ever had to run again. In the end, Caleb and Clara's story isn't just about the Old West. It's about something timeless, choosing courage over fear, truth over silence, and finding a place where you belong. In our modern lives, the Ghost Forks still exist. Maybe not dusty towns on the frontier, but quiet corners where injustice hides, where good people are tempted to keep their heads down. Caleb reminds us that standing up for what's right often comes with a cost, but it also comes with a reward you can't buy. Self-respect. Clara shows us that healing takes time. Trust is built in small acts, and reclaiming your name, your identity, can be the most powerful victory of all. Maybe you see pieces of their journey in your own life, a time when you chose to speak up, or when someone's quiet loyalty helped you find your footing again. But what if the story didn't end here? What if someone from Clara's past returned, not as an enemy, but carrying a truth she never knew? Or what if the peace they built in Last Canyon was just the first chapter of a larger fight for justice across the West? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What lessons from Caleb and Clara's journey do you think matter most today? Could their story have ended differently? And should it? Share your ideas in the comments. Your words keep this campfire conversation alive. Thank you for riding along with us on the West that never left. If this story stirred something in your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next tale from the frontier, because the spirit of the West never truly left.